Welcome to this introductory video of the dashboard template. This video will explain how the template and how Voltapp diagrams work. So let's get started. It's super easy. Let's start with going to the template category and clicking on the template and copying it. Once we arrive on the page, it means that our template has been copied correctly. So it will now appear in our home. We can rename it, obviously, to recognize it if we wanted to create multiple dashboards, for example. So the first thing we notice in the template is this Airtable node, and that is because the dashboard template is connected to an Airtable database. If I click play, we can see that we have a list of users that is loaded directly from an Airtable database. The number of users here is also calculated using a database as well as here for the stats. For example, to know the number of people who have taken a given plan, it is directly deduced from the Airtable database. We will see how to connect the database to your own database. You can either create your own database with your own data, and I'll let you do that yourself if you want to. Feel free to go and see more in-depth tutorials on how to use Airtable for that. What I'm going to show you first is simply how to copy an existing database. And so for that, you will have in the descriptions a link to the database to copy so that you can follow along step by step with me. Then you click on here, use this data. I then put it in my dashboard. I don't have a basic database to copy, so I'm going to remedy that by going to Airtable. I'm going to create a new database that I'm going to call my dashboard. Then I'm going to go back. I'm going to use my dashboard and create table here. So there you go. Now I have my database. The table that we had as a base is no longer needed, and so we can delete it. And that's all there is to do. I have my database, which is the same data as in the template. There is a field for the name, email, avatar, which plan we use, the date creation of the user, their ID, etc., etc. And it's filled with default data. You're free to modify it as you wish, but we're going to use the database as it is. To do this, in your Airtable node, you have to put the API key here. And so to do that, it's quite simple. We go to our account like this. We get the key that's here, we copy and paste it back into here. Once it's done, we'll have the possibility to choose our databases directly. So here you can see we don't have access to the new databases. And this is normal, because when this Airtable node was created, the database did not exist yet. So to fix this, it's simple. I'll just take an Airtable node and put it here. I'm going to copy and paste my key, put it in here, and here we can see that there are many more databases, including my dashboard. I'll be able to retrieve it, simply connect to user, and there you go. So up here, it's relatively simple. Then if I go to the graph here, we can see that my Airtable graph has a little graph that does certain things. So we can start here with this yellow block, and we call this an action. This action is directly created by the Airtable block in question. It will allow you to simply retrieve the users and then define that in the user variable. We also see a small pink block, and it's called custom events. These are events that will be directly created by a node and that can be called by elements below. Here, in this case, refresh. As you can see, if I hit play, there is a refresh button to update the data. It's connected directly to the refresh event. So if I am here and I click on it, you can see that it is connected to the refresh event. So now what I'm going to do in my new Airtable node is simply create a new refresh event. I go to my blocks here, and I create an event that I call refresh. so that I can use it underneath. Now the logic is the same, so we can just copy and paste this. Copy the section and paste it. And just like that, we see that the block that has disappeared is simply the recovery rows block, and that's normal. It's because it's created by this Airtable node. And we want to create it by this one, so what I'm going to do simply is to recover the lines. So here I'm going to do at the time of the refresh, and also when it appears. And for the sorting, if the sorting changes, I'll redo the retrieve lines connection. So as you can see, it's the same. And here, I'm just going to define user from the lines that I've recovered. Finally, one last thing we can try is the sort. Basically, it's the what are we going to use to sort? Well, it's the same thing. Once we're there, we connect this information directly to the Airtable request. We can do it very easily. We go here, and we connect it to sort. There, we have the same thing, and so we can take our page and move it here. We can see that there are just the refresh box that will be disconnected. So I'll add it here. And then I can go to the button. So I click on the refresh button here, and I just have to reconnect refresh. There's another place, you can't see it, but if I go to the user screen, there's another refresh button here. I click on it, and I reconnect refresh. So normally, everything is connected correctly. And there, if I delete the old Airtable node that was connected to the old dashboard base, and now to our new base that we have created. Normally, if I hit play, everything will connect correctly. We have our users who are correctly filled. And the same goes for total, which is recalculated correctly, and the same goes for our stats, which we can also see are working correctly. So what I'm going to do now is explain to you in a little more detail how the stats work. It's quite easy. They're just nodes. So if you go to the nodes here, you'll see that there are bar graph nodes, pie graph nodes, curve graph nodes, and so on. In fact, these nodes have a lot of little parameters that allow you to configure them. But the one we're going to focus on the most is the data attribute. This data attribute, if I click on it, we can see that it's a list. So I can add several of them. In the case of curves, we will simply have one element, one object per curve. Here, typically, we have a curve, but if I do this, I can add a second curve. I can choose its color. I can also add data. So for example, here we can say January, so Jan. We can put 10, Feb, 20, and March 30. So here we see the beginning of a curve that is starting to take place. The idea is to have a list that allows you to configure the data, so each time we'll have the name of the curve, and then we'll see your x and y values that correspond to the coordinates to place each of the points on. And so that's how it works in the case of a curve, but each graph works differently. What's most interesting is that we can simply make a variable. Then we'll retrieve it easily, for example, from a JSON from the last table directly, or calculate it from another piece of information. So there I showed you the curve diagram, but normally when I go into stats, I go into overview, I close it, I go into my charts, and here's this graph, which is a pie chart already connected to a variable, as you can see. In fact, this variable is deduced, calculated directly from the table. I'll explain quite quickly how it works. We'll simply look to see if the user variable has changed. or if we're going to do it once at the beginning. What we're going to do is reset the data variable, which is connected to a graph. In the same way as I showed you, the curves and this data variable work in a simple way if we have objects that correspond to each slice of the pie chart. So basically, ID is just to have a unique identifier for each slice of pie. Label is what corresponds to the legend, so what we're going to display for each of the value pie slices. Value is its percentage on the pie chart, and the color is the color. So by default, we're just going to put it as ID and label as free, as value 0, and as color the corresponding color. Here we have free. We have the same thing for personal, and the same thing for company. And so there, we'll set all of the values to 0. Then what we'll do is we'll stretch it over our users, and for each user, we'll look at the plan. So we'll check its value, and we'll quote an index variable at 0, 1, 2, or 3, depending on whether it's free, pros, or enterprise. This index will simply correspond in our data to the index in the list, so it corresponds to 0, 1, 2, and 3. Then it will allow us to modify our list, and what we're going to do is modify the element of the list to the corresponding index. We're just going to take the element of the list in question. We're going to keep the same ID, the same label, the same color, and we're just going to take the value that was at 0, and we're going to increment it by 1. And so, little by little, we're going to fill in our data, and this will allow us to display the right values. So we can see here we had a certain number of free and a certain number of enterprise and of pros. And then, by iterating on all of that and filling it in, we can see here that in the statistics, we display the right information. Each of the curves work like this. Either we will have a value that corresponds, or we will have an x and a y for the curves, as I showed you earlier. In the case of the curve diagrams, the interesting thing is that everything works with variables, and so you just have to fill in this variable and create it as you wish, depending on which data you need to display. Thanks for watching this video. We hope you feel more at ease using the dashboard template now, and that hopefully you'll make good use of it in your diagrams for your future Voltapp projects. See you in the next video.